Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of The Higher Ed Marketer. You've probably not heard my voice before, so please let me introduce myself. I'm Rob Conlon, executive producer of this show. It's been my pleasure to work with Bart and Troy over the past year to create this show to help the higher ed marketing space grow and improve in these challenging times. Before we dive into today's episode with very special guest Brian Kenny of the Harvard Business School, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the absolute truckload of hard work and dedication from Bart and Troy that makes this podcast work. Their willingness to show up week after week with amazing guests has led this show to be named number 4 on Terminalfour's 2021 list of the top 10 podcasts for higher ed marketing and recruitment teams. I'm incredibly proud of both of them and this show for shedding new light on the cutting edge of marketing for higher ed institutions, and I certainly hope that you'll enjoy this episode, not only for our renowned guest, but with also some of the new additional touches that just make it shine a little bit more. So please, sit back and enjoy this deeply insightful conversation today and help us celebrate 50 fabulous episodes of The Higher Ed Marketer.
You're listening to The Higher Ed Marketer, a podcast geared towards marketing professionals in higher education. This show will tackle all sorts of questions related to student recruitment, donor relations, marketing trends, new technologies, and so much more. If you're looking for conversations centered around where the industry is going, this podcast is for you. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to the Higher Ed Marketer Podcast. I'm Troy Singer, and I'm here with my co-host and most sincerely one of the best business partners I could ever have, Bart Kaler. And today we are bringing you our 50th episode of the Higher Ed Marketer Podcast. How does it feel to be 50, Bart?
It's pretty incredible. It's for the second time for me, as far as years, I should say. But I'm so proud of the work that has gone in over the last year, and it's been an honor to share that road with you, Troy.
Thank you. And today, our guest is Brian Kenny, who is the CMO of the Harvard Business School. And our conversation with him today is really, what is the truth about managing a very strong, popular brand? And Bart, the reason why we felt it would be good to have this conversation is so often you and I are encountering people that saying, if I managed a brand like Harvard, it would be an easy marketing job. So you, to your credit, reached out and was able to get the CMO of Harvard as a guest so we could talk to him about that and then get some other thoughts that are very interesting about the CMO role.
Yeah, I thought it was a great opportunity, and I was really thrilled that Brian, reached back out so quickly and said, "Wow, you've got a great podcast, and a really impressive list of folks you've talked to." So thank you, all the previous folks that we've had as guests. But really, the question came down to is, do the elite of the elite really need to be able to market? And I think that you'll find this conversation really a good one. I think Brian kind of lets you in on some of the things that he's challenged as Chief Marketing Officer of the Harvard Business School. And he'll go into some of the details that are unique to Harvard. But in essence, really pay attention, because a lot of this is not unique to Harvard. It's unique to higher education marketing. And so I think he really gives you some great feedback and great tips that you can apply to your own school.
Yes, the first half is really about that and Harvard Business School overall and its podcast. But then the second part is about the H-bomb. And without further ado, here is Brian Kenny. We are proud to welcome Brian Kenny, Chief Marketing and Communications Officer for the Harvard Business School, to the Higher Ed Marketer Podcast. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. If we could ask you first, tell us a little bit about yourself and then also your role at the Harvard Business School.
Sure. Well, first, I'm thrilled to be here. Great to be a guest on your show. I'm the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer at Harvard Business School. I have the distinction, I guess, of being the first to hold that title, which is a mixed blessing, which we'll probably talk about at some point. But I've been in this role for coming up on 14 years, which anybody knows that, in a marketer's life, 14 years is like 5 eternities. It's a really long time to be in the same role. And I think a little bit it speaks to the nature of, the exciting and dynamic nature of Harvard Business School. I've been in and out of higher education throughout my career. I've worked at 3 major universities in Boston, plus a small college, always in a marketing communications role. But I also stepped out for, a decade or so and worked in the private sector in both professional services and high tech. So I've had, a little bit of experience in other worlds that I brought back to higher ed when I returned to this sector. And I think it helped me to see things maybe from a different perspective than somebody who's always been in higher education. And these days, I have lots of conversations with people who have always been in the private sector and they're thinking about their next career and they really want to explore higher ed as an opportunity. So I think it's a great thing for anybody to explore. I also think it's the most challenging marketing role that you can have, and I'm happy to go deeper on that and explain why I believe that to be true. Harvard Business School, for those of your listeners who aren't, they know the name, but if they're not familiar with the enterprise, we are about $1 billion enterprise, 850 million roughly to $1 billion. And we're known for the MBA program, which is where we started, first school ever to grant the Master's in Business Administration. But we also have an executive education program that teaches about 12,000 executives who come through a year. We have an online program where we're reaching tens of thousands of people a year. And we have a publishing enterprise that does Harvard Business Review as well as business books and a whole host of other kinds of publications as well as corporate training products. So it's a pretty diverse institution, all focused on management education in one realm or another.
That's great. Thank you, Brian, for giving us that introduction. And certainly that's a large portfolio for a chief marketing and communications officer to manage. How does that, certainly part of it is what I would consider traditional higher education, but then there's aspects of it are, the publishing arm and other things like that. How are you kind of relating all that together? And maybe that goes back to your initial comment about, it's one of the hardest marketing roles that you can do.
Yeah, it does a little bit. I think that's true no matter what institution you're in. I think education is, the various audiences that you have to think about as a marketing person in education is quite different than if you're selling a particular product or service. It's easier to identify that target market that you've got in those other endeavors. In education, you've got to think about students and alumni and, town gown issues and the general public and, so the academy, all these other audiences that you've got to think about. So you're constantly shape-shifting from one meeting to the next, where you might be talking about a social media strategy in the first meeting that's targeted to prospective students, and then you're having a meeting about how are you going to deal with this building construction project that you've got going in the heart of the city, and you've got neighbors around you that are riled up about it. So I think it's challenging because of it's constantly calling on you to adapt and to address different kinds of situations. If I think about my role at Harvard Business School, that business experience that I had really became very helpful to me here. When I was in professional services, I was working for management consulting firms, and I got a really deep dive on the kinds of issues that C-level executives have to think about on a day-to-day basis. And that experience, when I came to Harvard Business School, it felt like the combination of the educational experience that I had plus the business background, really came full circle and dovetailed nicely at a place like HBS, which is a little bit like a business and a little bit like an educational institution. We're bringing both of those worlds together. And one of the things that HBS is known for is that the business case studies that we write are based on actual business issues challenges that leaders have had. And so, the way that our faculty think, the way that the leadership team runs the school is very much like you would see in a corporate setting where we're thinking a lot about the business strategy of the school.
Great.
Brian, another aspect of the business school is that you have your own podcast. And if you could tell us about Cold Call and what its mission is, and maybe how the university utilizes that podcast in its marketing efforts.
Yeah, I would love to talk about my podcast. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. So I love podcasts. I listen to them. I've listened to them for a long time. And, I saw when podcasting became a little bit more accessible because bandwidth became better and you could actually listen to podcasts when you were on the go, that to me marked an opportunity for us to think about a different way of getting the word out about the work at Harvard Business School. My job, the job that I described for my team, theme that we do every day is to tell stories that animate the mission of the school and the work of the school. And part of that is bringing the voices of the people who are doing the work to the surface. And when I say voices, I can mean that literally, or I can mean it in writing and other ways. But podcasts are really a great way to humanize somebody. And for a long time, there was a mystique about Harvard Business School, and that worked for probably the first 80 or 90 years of our existence. But we live in a time where people want transparency, they want access. Social media has made that available, and I think it's really helped us to help people see that the things that faculty and students at HBS do are very impressive and very ambitious, and they are changing the world in many ways. But at the same time, these are just people, and when you hear them talk about the business cases they write and the work that they do, it really brings it right down to earth and humanizes them and knocks away a lot of the mystique that maybe creates a barrier between us and the public. And one other thing I would say about Cold Call, every episode features me talking to a faculty member about a business case they've written. We teach by the case method, and many other business schools have adopted the case method as a way of teaching. Every case is a story, and every story is something that anybody who's in any aspect of business should be able to listen to and pull a lesson away from. So we think it's a great way to show the relevance of case method research.
That's great. And I guess I would do a follow-up question on that, Brian, is the fact that, you know, you talk about authenticity and being able to show that real aspect of the faculty and of HBS and other aspects of the institution. Would you say that that's even more important? I mean, certainly podcasts allow you to do that, but isn't that more important for the generations that we're dealing with, like millennials and Zs and, you know, I'm an Xer. I think that, you know, it's that mystique still kind of plays in a little bit with our generation, I think. But I think as you get further, younger generations, that mystique starts to kind of rub them a little bit the wrong way, and they do want that authenticity. Is that what you're finding?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And, you know, I feel like everybody's got their mobile device in their hand all the time. We've got a generation now coming up who are, you know, they're looking at TikTok, they're looking at short form video. You know, they don't necessarily want to have to. I think there's a couple of dynamics. One is they want the information to be there when they want it, when they need it, when they're ready to consume it. Podcasts are on demand, so you know you can download that anytime you want. They're very convenient in terms of being able to listen to them while you're doing something else. And I think it's a medium that allows the listener to go deeper than they would if they were just scrolling through their feed. Right. You know, they're going to look at maybe a 2-minute video, but they're willing to invest in a 20 or 30-minute podcast if the content is good and relevant, and if they're in a place where they're going to be there for 20 or 30 minutes. So for a lot of us, that's the car during our commute, or that's the gym when you're on the treadmill. Podcasts have made it really easy for people to, again, enjoy long-form content, whereas I wouldn't expect a lot of people in my children's generation, they're in their 20s, to read a Harvard Business Review article. I just wouldn't. And that's a reality that I think we're all reckoning with. And HBR has known this for a while. They've scaled back from monthly issues to bi-monthly, so they do 6 printed issues a year. And even within those issues, they have experimented with shorter articles and, you know, case briefs and things like that as a way to address this. And they also do podcasts, obviously. Right. You know, so I think podcasts are solving a number of different challenges that we encounter when we're trying to take complex ideas and make them relatable.
That's great. That's great. And kind of as another, you know, kind of going into another direction here, when we talk about, you know, the authenticity and that mystique and other elements around that, and I think that, you know, you and I talked in the preview with Troy in the pre-interview. I kind of joked with you about the idea that so many times I have, you know, some of my clients who bemoan a little bit to say, boy, if I were Harvard, I wouldn't have to market as hard. And, you know, you had referenced something about what you kind of call the H-bomb. Tell us a little bit about that and how that relates to kind of what I'm hearing on my end.
Sure. So the H-bomb is by the way, I will say that when I got this job, you know, I called my mother who is a huge fan of Harvard University, and she was elated that I got hired to work at Harvard Business School. And she said, after a minute or so of congratulatory comments, she said, "But wait a second, why do they need a chief marketing officer?" Which is a question I get a lot. Yeah. And I understand it, believe me. So I would say that the H-bomb phenomenon is something that Harvard alumni speak about pretty regularly. And it boils down to people who are affiliated with Harvard, whether it's faculty or alumni or students or staff. They're always a little careful how they introduce that credential into a conversation, because the Harvard brand, although it is well known and well respected in most circles, it's also viewed negatively, in a lot of ways. People think about it as an elitist brand. They think that people who are part of Harvard University are intellectual elites or academic elites. They're arrogant. At Harvard Business School, we hear about words like greedy and self-centered a lot. I understand those perceptions exist, and candidly, I had some of those. Mm-hmm. When you work at other institutions, it's easy to look at a place like Harvard and say, man, they've got it easy. Look at that endowment. Now, anybody who knows about endowments knows that it's not like a bank. You can't go withdraw money from the endowment. You need them. They're important, but they're also earmarked for a lot of things. So I think a big part of our job, those of us who are in marketing roles across Harvard University, and I should just clarify, I only do marketing for the business school. Right. Harvard is a very decentralized place, and the law school has their own person, and the Kennedy School, and so on and so forth. But I think a big part of my job is to help knock down those misperceptions about what it's like being at Harvard. We are an elite institution, and I think that's important, and that's a big part of our identity. But we're not elitist. We want the best people from around the world to come and study and work and teach at Harvard Business School. For us, it's very, very important to have as diverse a group as possible, and that means diversity in every realm. So, the better job that we can do helping anybody who hears about us see themselves at Harvard Business School, that's important for us to continue to work on.
That's great. And I think you even talked about too that, sometimes, something bad happens in business, eyes get turned a little bit to HBS and kind of, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think I told you I started in 2008 in April, and in October of that year, Lehman Brothers folded and the world economic collapse hit, and was very, that happened on a Friday, and the emails that were flying around over the weekend were basically, between the dean and the leadership team, where it's not going to be long before the world points their finger at Harvard Business School and says, why did you let this happen? And that is something that sort of goes hand in hand with being the category leader. HBS is looked at as sort of, one of the pinnacle business schools in the world. And there's a couple of others that are in that rarefied air, but we're certainly one of them. And it's understandable that when, something goes wrong in the business world, the connective tissue between HBS and Wall Street is pretty strong. And I understand that people look at us for that. So we talked at that time and ever since then, where we face criticism like this, our first reaction is not to be defensive. It's to be self-critical. It's to look at ourselves and say, well, wait a second, is there some truth to this? Should we be thinking about what we're hearing here? And should it in some way cause us to change the way that we think about how we do our jobs and how we educate students? So self-accountability is kind of the first reaction. And I would say that, over the years, there's been many instances. And in fact, there's been books about every 3 years. Somebody writes a book that's critical of the business school. We always read that. There's always going to be a portion of it that is a little hyperbolic and that we can easily cast off. But there's almost always a kernel of truth to something that's in there. And we have to be able to read that and then be circumspect about it and look at ourselves and make sure that we are being authentic to what we say we are. So that's kind of the reaction that we have when those things happen.
Yeah. And I love the fact that, a lot of what's coming out of this conversation is the idea that while, yes, it's a recognizable brand, and yes, you've got some challenges in the way that the H-bomb and other things like that. At the end of the day, it's a lot about managing that tension and managing those, the classic Venn diagram where you've got, what the world believes you are and who you really are and what they need. And, kind of finding that, soft spot in the middle. It seems like that could be applied to really any school, whether it's a large elite school like HBS or whether it's a small private that has a few hundred students. It's really managing that tension of who you are, what you're known for, and what that student needs.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I would say that every academic institution, to some extent, faces the same challenge that Harvard does. Harvard's been around longer than the rest. So there's a term that we talk about called heritage brands, and most academic brands are heritage brands to some extent. They've got a history that's a really important part of their identity and their value system. And that history is important to hold on to. At the same time, if you let that be your defining brand characteristic, then you're kind of stuck in time and you can't really be looked at as innovative and forward thinking. So the tension that we're always trying to balance is, Harvard University's been around for 70 plus years or something. Harvard Business School's been around for 114 years at this point. We love our past. We love our heritage. At the same time, we don't want people to think that we aren't innovative and entrepreneurial.
Right.
So we try to hold on to the qualities of the past that we think give us strength and demonstrate our leadership. And at the same time, we want people to know that we are thinking about the future of management education, not the past.
That's great.
In our previous conversation, you had mentioned both some advantages and some obstacles that I want to make sure we revisit in our conversation today. One of them that was an aha for me is when you're managing a strong brand or what's perceived to be a strong brand, there's an issue with not being able to create a sense of urgency. And I would like to know if you can let everyone know what you mean by that.
Yes, happy to. So yes, I mean, so it's great when things are going well and your brand is strong and it's well recognized. Of course, that's wonderful. And, we have the benefit of having very generous alumni who have been generous to us throughout the years. And that's why we have such a big endowment and fundraising base. I think the flip side to that is it's hard to create a sense of urgency when there's no burning platform. If you're in the private sector, if you're in a firm where sales aren't where they need to be, and you're not going to make your targets. Maybe you're a public company and you got to make your goal before the next quarterly report. It's in the marketing role in those situations. It's pretty easy to say, we need more funds to go do this and fix this thing, or else we're going to be in real trouble. That urgency has never existed in that way at the time that I've been at Harvard Business School. In fact, the school had never run a deficit until 2 years ago. Was it 2 years ago? It might have been last year. I get my fiscal years mixed up. But when COVID hit, like everybody else, we had to, on a dime, move everything to remote. And that meant we had to shut down our executive education program, which was a huge hit to the school's financials. As a result of that, of 12 plus months of not having executive education, we ran a deficit one year. And that was a big blow, in terms of our ability to always operate as an efficient business, which we pride ourselves on. That's really the closest we've come to having a burning platform in the time that I've been there. And that wasn't something that marketing could fix. That was, unfortunately, that was a pandemic, and we're still kind of facing that a little bit. So I think I often find myself in this situation where I am really advocating for brand maintenance. And maintenance matters. If you don't maintain your foundation, your brand is your foundation, and if you're not working to make sure that foundation stays strong, then erosion will happen. You have to actively manage it or erosion will happen. That's an argument that I'm able to make that I think people understand at the business school, because we take a lot of pride in making sure that we maintain our educational foundation and we maintain the foundation of the physical campus that we're on, because it's such an important part of what we do. So I found a way to kind of make that my argument, for investing in the marketing organization and in actively managing the brand. Might work for some of your other listeners. I don't know.
That's great. I really like how that plays out, and I think that that's a great example. And you're right. I mean, the pandemic has impacted everybody, and it's kind of evened out a lot of those things. And it's interesting to me that, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners would find too, that being able to pivot like that. I mean, some folks weren't able to pivot. I mean, so many people say, oh, well, we just went into our online platform. Well, there were a lot of schools that didn't have an online platform or didn't have, like with your executive education, that was not a possibility. So it's interesting that, we are all trying to figure things out in this time as well.
Sure.
Another challenge that you face, Brian, is when something happens that's popular or maybe negative in the business community, fingers get pointed at Harvard, rightly or wrongly. Again, if you can explain that scenario and, how you manage that or how that affects your role.
Yeah. So, I think for our first reaction whenever those kinds of things happen is that we want to listen to what's being said, and we want to take a hard look at ourselves before. I find that the instinctual reaction of being defensive rarely works. And this is true in every place I've been, whether it's been in higher education or in the private sector. You can't be defensive without sounding defensive. And oftentimes we find that there is some truth to what some of those criticisms might be about the school. So the first thing we try to do is take a hard look at ourselves and say, is there some truth here? Is there something we should be doing differently as a way to address this issue? Our students are often challenging us on the decisions that we make as an institution. And I think this is something we all face in higher education, is that we've got smart, ambitious students. We're surrounded by them, and they're looking at what we're doing, and they're looking at us as examples of how to lead. And they're going to challenge us when they think we're not making the right decisions. So again, we try to take that posture of saying, well, let's take a step back and listen to what they're saying. And, if there's some validity to their concerns, then we need to address that, So that really extends into our leadership style, I think, generally speaking. I'm fortunate to be part of a leadership team that's been largely intact the whole time that I've been there. We've turned over a few key positions, but if you look at the way that the school has been run from the administrative side, that management team has been pretty solid, and I feel like we've been able to weather the storm through things like the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, which really caused all of us. That's probably a good thing to just pause on for a second. We had always talked about the importance of inclusivity and diversity, and we believed it, I think. It was important to us, but it was always just it was in the ether, but it wasn't really something that we were really doubling down on. And the murder of George Floyd and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement made us and pretty much everybody else go, wait a second, there's something different about this. We really have to think hard about this. So, this leadership team that I'm fortunate to be part of, we really focused in on that. And the dean did, and the academic leadership dean did. And we involved the students. And I'm happy to say that the outcome of that has been a sustained, really intensive effort to improve racial equity across Harvard Business School, to bring in, diverse faculty, to bring in a more diverse student population. And there's a plan that we've now got in place, and we're following the plan, and we're seeing the progress that's come about as a result of that. That's a situation where the criticism was warranted, and we've done something about it. So I like that we're able to, I think, respond to these situations and rise to the occasion. And I think it's important that we all try to do that in our roles as leaders in these institutions.
Brian, as we close our episode today, as everyone knows, we see Harvard as the gold standard. We'd like to ask for a last piece of advice from you. So if there's a piece of advice that you would offer other marketing officers that they could implement right away, what would that piece of advice be?
It's a really great question. It's a really hard question, Troy. Thank you. Thank you for leaving me with a hard one. I'm going to give the advice that I often give to people when they start at Harvard Business School. I talked about the H-bomb earlier. There's another phenomenon that happens, and I think it happens, in all walks of life, not just at places like Harvard, but maybe it's a little more, intense at Harvard, where the students on the first day of class, where they're being welcomed by the dean, will often talk about sitting there thinking, oh my God, they made a mistake. How did I get into this place? What am I doing here? They picked the wrong person. And I think if you talk to pretty much anybody who starts a new job anywhere, who finds themselves in a position where they've all of a sudden got new challenges and they've got to manage people, and they probably are thinking the same thing, like, oh my God, I faked my way into this thing, and now what am I going to do? I've got to really live up to it, and I've got to deliver. So on the one hand, I would say that kind of self-doubt is not a bad thing, because it makes you really focus and think hard about what you have to do. On the other hand, I would say that from where I sit now, having been in, different roles for many, many years. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but I'm probably older than most of your listeners. I would say for me, the one thing that has helped and that I tell other people to do is to listen, really listen to what people are saying and listen twice as much as you speak. Some leaders have a tendency, I think, to feel like they need to solve the problem right away. They need to step into the meeting and size things up quickly and show that they're decisive. And oftentimes, if you just let things play out and you let the conversation play out for a while, good ideas will emerge. And, maybe your job is just to facilitate those and to keep them coming out. And you do that by clearing the air and just kind of letting people offer their advice and insights and expertise, because chances are you're surrounded by pretty smart, capable people. And if you give them an opportunity, you might be surprised at what they're able to accomplish. And then you just get the glow effect of working with them. So I would say my advice, something you could start right away, is to just really step back and listen, with intent.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that. We really appreciate you being our guest on our 50th episode. We wanted this to be a special episode, and you've certainly delivered. For anyone who would like to contact you to continue the conversation or follow up on one of the points that you made, what would be the best way for them to contact you?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for it's quite an honor to be your 50th guest. I really do appreciate that. So Bart and Troy, thank you for having me as your 50th guest. And I've enjoyed the conversation. I'm happy to keep an eye. People can find me on Twitter at HBSCMO. That's probably the best and easiest way to get to me. So happy to, if they want a direct message even or that kind of thing, I'm happy to respond.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Bart, do you have any words that you would like to leave us with on our 50th episode?
Yeah, this has been quite an episode. So, Brian, thank you. A couple things that I just wanted to point out and kind of pull out from some of the things that Brian had said. I think so many times, and he kind of alluded to this in several different points, but we all like to look at the other side of the fence and say, oh, look how green the grass is over there. And boy, that would be a nice problem to have. And everybody has their own challenges. It doesn't matter if we're, a small private college that we've talked to that a lot of you out there listening are small private colleges, and I know who you are, as well as all the way up to, the oldest institution in the country, Harvard University. We all have our own challenges. We all have our own victories and our own successes. Sometimes it's better to just kind of, take a step back and listen and get your breath and just kind of go back to some of the basics of blocking and tackling and marketing. And so I think that was a really good point. We all have different senses of urgency, and sometimes you don't have that, which is another problem. And so I think that Brian kind of pointed out that there's a lot of similarity all the way through higher ed. I really appreciated him saying that the role of a higher ed marketer is sometimes one of the hardest roles in marketing, period. And I think that that's something that you might want to take back to your cabinet and your leadership and let them know that the CMO of HBS said this. So I think that, because we've talked to Ethan Braden at Purdue, and his notion of, we need to be the drivers on campus of the brand and of the marketing. When it comes out of the marketing department, we can't be driven. We can't be the short order cooks who have to make it look prettier by Monday. So I think there's a lot of really good things to kind of hone in and take into these things and really kind of apply to your own campus. I also really appreciated just the intentionality that I hear in Brian personally, as well as in Harvard Business School, because you talked a little bit about the DEI types of things with inclusivity and with the Black Lives Matter and the intentionality that Harvard has put together with a plan. I think those types of things, and even his last tip there, where he talked about just quite honestly, the intentionality of improving your emotional intelligence, of being able to slow down, being able to listen when you feel like you might want to talk. I think those types of things of being an intentional marketer, an intentional person, an intentional member of the team is going to be so critical. So again, thank you so much, Brian. Really honored to have you on the show today.
That was a nice summation, Bart. Appreciate that. And congratulations to you guys on 50 episodes, by the way. I know as a podcaster, that's a big number. That's a good one.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are very proud of that. And I want to thank everyone for joining us on another edition, our 50th episode of the Higher Ed Marketer Podcast, which is sponsored by Kaler Solutions, an education marketing and branding agency. and by Think Patented, a marketing execution company combining personalization and customization for your print and mailing campaigns. On behalf of Bart Kaler, my co-host, I'm Troy Singer. Thank you for joining our 50th episode.
You've been listening to The Higher Ed Marketer. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you're listening with Apple Podcasts, we'd love for you to leave a quick rating of the show. Simply tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. Until next time.